One waitress, one mean rich guy and a big piano. What started as a mean trick to embarrass her turned into a moment that made the whole room go quiet and broke big egos. You won't believe how she turned things around with just her amazing skills. It was a warm Friday night, and people were talking and laughing at La Fontaine, a fancy restaurant in the middle of Raleigh, North Carolina. You could hear glasses clinking, waiters walking quietly, and soft jazz music from a piano in the corner. It felt like a really fancy place where rich people came to eat. Deborah was a 25-year-old waitress who was quiet but had a special sparkle in her eyes. She moved quickly between tables, carrying plates and smiling. To most customers, she was just another person in a uniform, but inside she had dreams way bigger than the fancy dining room around her. Deborah's real love wasn't serving food, it was music. Ever since she was little, the piano had been her safe place, where she could show every happy feeling, every sad feeling, and every thought she couldn't say out loud. But dreams don't pay for rent and food. Working long hours at La Fontaine was something she had to do, like a stepping stone to get to the music school she really wanted to go to. Not many people knew she could play piano really well, except for the restaurant workers who sometimes saw her sneaking over to play the old piano in the back room during her breaks. That night, as the busy dinner time was starting to calm down, the door opened and in walked Leonard Grayson. Everyone could tell right away who he was. The rich businessman walked in like he owned the place, with some other fancy-dressed friends following him. Leonard acted like he was better than everyone else. He was known for saying mean things and causing drama. When he showed up, even the workers who had been there for years stood up straighter. Deborah's co-workers looked at each other with knowing looks. Leonard was not an easy customer. He was the kind of person who liked to bother people and make them upset just for fun. But to Deborah, he was just another table she had to take care of during a long night at work. But this wasn't going to be a normal night. As Leonard looked around the room, his eyes stopped on Deborah. Something about her seemed to catch his attention. He paused for a moment, then smiled in a mean way. Deborah felt him staring at her but ignored it, focusing on filling up water glasses and cleaning tables. But Leonard wasn't done with her. He had already decided she was going to be his entertainment for the night. Deborah had grown up in a small town in South Carolina, where big dreams often felt as far away as the stars. Her mom was a single parent who worked really hard as a nurse, working extra shifts to make sure Deborah and her brothers and sisters had food to eat. Even though they didn't have much money, music had always been important in their home. Her mom's old records and the broken piano that a neighbor gave them were what made Deborah fall in love with music. That piano became her escape. While other kids played outside, Deborah spent hours teaching herself how to play. She copied songs from the radio, then tried playing classical music she found in used music books. Her talent didn't go unnoticed. She played at church, school concerts, and community events, but being recognized couldn't fix the money problems that stood in the way of her dreams. By the time she turned 18, the truth was clear. A professional music career would have to wait. She didn't get scholarships, and her family needed her help. Deborah put away her concert dreams, replacing them with the need to make money to live. But she couldn't completely give up. The piano was more than just a dream. It was who she was. When she moved to Raleigh a few years ago, Deborah looked for a job at La Fontaine, not just because of the money, but because of the big piano in the corner of the restaurant. Even though she rarely had time to play it, just knowing it was there made her feel comfortable. Music hadn't left her. It was just waiting. That night, as Leonard and his group sat down at their table, Deborah walked over to them carrying a tray like she always did. Leonard ordered expensive scotch and told a joke loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Deborah gave a polite smile as she took their orders, her voice steady even though she felt something strange and uncomfortable about him. "Deborah, huh?" Leonard said, looking at her name tag. "Sounds like someone with a lot of hidden talents." The comment surprised her, but she nodded politely and walked away to give their orders to the kitchen. She didn't notice the knowing smile he shared with his friends or the way his eyes followed her every move. But Leonard wasn't just watching, he was planning. And Deborah would soon find herself in the middle of a show she never asked for. The night went on like any other, with the sounds of laughter and forks and knives filling the room. Deborah kept working at her normal pace, trying not to look at Leonard as she moved between tables. She had dealt with difficult customers before, but something about him felt different. Not just rude, but like he was planning something. His presence felt like a dark shadow, making her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't quite explain. By the time the appetizers were served, Leonard had already started his show, though not the kind Deborah expected. He held everyone's attention at his table, loudly telling stories about how successful he was, and making fun of people who didn't have big goals. His friends laughed like they had to, while other diners gave annoyed looks in his direction. Deborah tried to stay focused on her work, but as she came back to his table with a bottle of wine, Leonard caught her off guard. "Tell me, Deborah," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "What do you do when you're not carrying plates? Surely a young woman like you has dreams." His words made her stop moving. Deborah hesitated, then gave a careful answer. "I play piano sometimes," she said quietly, hoping to keep it short. Leonard's eyes lit up, and a sneaky smile spread across his face. "A pianist, huh? How interesting. Why don't you give us a little performance?" Deborah froze. The room seemed to get quiet, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "Oh, I couldn't," she said quickly, forcing a nervous laugh. "I'm just here to work tonight." But Leonard wasn't about to let it go. "Nonsense," he said loudly. "There's a piano right there in the corner. Show us what you've got. Surely a future star like you isn't afraid of a little audience." His friends chuckled, clearly enjoying the show. Other diners turned their heads, curious about what was happening. Deborah's chest felt tight. She could feel everyone staring at her, the silent judgment waiting to happen. She wanted to say no, to walk away, but Leonard's challenge hung in, the air daring her to either rise to it or fall apart under pressure. "I really shouldn't," Deborah said nervously, looking around for support. But even her co-workers seemed afraid to step in. Leonard leaned back in his chair, sipping his scotch. With a smirk, "Ah, I see," he said mockingly. "All talk, no talent. That's disappointing." The words hit like a slap. Deborah's hands squeezed into fists at her sides. She wasn't someone who looked for fights, but the way he dismissed her like she was a joke, a nobody, hurt deeper than she expected. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Never let anyone make you small, Deborah. You're bigger than they'll ever know." A moment of silence stretched between them. Deborah looked at the piano, then back at Leonard. His smug expression dared her to take the bait, and against her better judgment, she did. "Fine," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "I'll play." The room buzzed with excitement as Deborah walked toward the piano, each step carrying the weight of both fear and defiance. The dining room seemed to hold its breath as Deborah got closer to the shining big piano. The soft light from the fancy light above made a spotlight on her, separating her from the whispering crowd. Her fingers shook as she sat down on the bench. The shiny keys looked like a challenge waiting to be met. Behind her, Leonard leaned, back in his chair looking smug and satisfied, like he had already won whatever game he was playing. Deborah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm down. Her heart was beating so loud she could barely think. This wasn't the church concert or the cozy community gatherings she used to know. This was different. This was mean. But there was no going back now. She put her hands on the keys, feeling their cool surface under her fingertips. The first notes were soft, unsure, almost fragile. A few diners moved in their seats, and someone coughed in the back of the room. Deborah ignored them, her focus getting sharper as she got into the music. She chose a song she knew by heart, a soulful version of Clair de Lune by Debussy. The melody flowed into the room, weaving through the air like a thread, delicate but strong. As her confidence grew, the music got bigger. Her hands moved with a grace that hid the chaos inside her, the notes pouring out like a confession. Each chord seemed to carry a piece of her story, the sacrifices her mother made, the nights she spent practicing in a cramped room, the weight of dreams put off but never given up. The diners fell silent, their earlier chatting replaced by complete stillness. Even Leonard, who had been whispering to his companions, went quiet. Deborah didn't need to look at him to feel the change in the room. The mocking energy had disappeared, replaced by something she couldn't quite name, perhaps awe, perhaps humility. The music soared, and Deborah let herself go. For the first time in what felt like years, she wasn't a waitress or a struggling dreamer. She was simply herself, an artist. Her fingers danced across the keys, drawing out emotions so raw and vivid, they seemed to hang in the air like smoke. By the time she played the final chord, the room was completely still. For a moment, there was no sound, just the lingering echo of the piano. Deborah sat frozen, her hands still resting on the keys, unsure of what would come next. Then, as though released from a spell, the audience burst into applause. The sound was thunderous, bouncing off the walls and filling the room with a warmth Deborah hadn't expected. Some diners stood up, clapping with an excitement that brought tears to her eyes. Her co-workers, who had been watching from the sidelines, joined in. their faces lit up with pride. Leonard, however, stayed seated. His smirk was gone, replaced by an expression Deborah couldn't quite figure out, part shock, part discomfort. He raised his hands and clapped slowly, a hollow sound compared to the cheers around him. But even his hesitant applause couldn't overshadow what Deborah had just done. She had gotten her voice back, and no amount of talking down to her could take that away. As the applause began to fade, the room seemed to breathe out altogether. Deborah slowly stood up, her knees still shaking, but her back straight. She looked around, and for the first time that evening, she truly saw the people watching her, not as spectators but as witnesses. Their faces showed something new, admiration, respect, and even a hint of awe. She didn't look at Leonard right away. Instead, she gave a small, polite nod to the diners who had clapped the loudest, her lips curving into a faint smile. It wasn't pride she felt, but relief that she hadn't let fear silence her. But then, as though pulled by a magnet, her gaze shifted to Leonard. He was still seated, his hands clasped in front of him on the table. The confident smirk he'd worn so boldly earlier was nowhere to be seen. Instead, his face was a mask of forced calmness, as though he couldn't decide whether to admit his mistake or keep being arrogant. "Well," Leonard finally said, his voice louder than it needed to, breaking the fragile silence that had settled over the room. "For that was unexpected," he chuckled lightly, though it lacked its usual boldness. "I suppose talent really does come from the most surprising places." The comment landed like a dull thud. His companions exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. Deborah tilted her head slightly, studying him. His words were meant to be a peace offering, but they were hollow, weighed down by his inability to truly own the moment. "Thank you," Deborah said, her tone steady and deliberate. There was no warmth in her voice, but no hostility either. She wasn't about to let him pull her back into the smallness he'd tried to force on her. Her performance had spoken louder than any comeback she could offer. Leonard cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of the room's collective gaze. He gestured toward the waiter for another drink, a flimsy attempt to get his composure back. "You've got quite a gift," he added almost reluctantly. Deborah nodded once, her gaze unwavering. "Everyone has a gift," she said, the weight of her words deliberate. "It's how you choose to use it that matters." The room seemed to hold its breath again, the subtle sting of her response rippling through the air. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it was enough. Leonard shifted in his seat, his usual air of dominance slipping further with each passing second. The diners began to turn their attention back to their meals, though the energy in the room had shifted entirely. Where there had once been the quiet hum of privilege and pretense, there was now something richer, a shared understanding, perhaps even respect for the waitress, who had reminded everyone of the power of being real. But Leonard wasn't just embarrassed, he was exposed. And no amount of charm could protect him from the truth everyone in the room now saw. Deborah stepped away from the piano, the weight of the moment settling in her chest. Her colleagues greeted her with quiet smiles and subtle nods of encouragement. As she returned to her station, she still had a job to finish, but something about her posture had changed. Her head was held a little higher, her movements more deliberate. Leonard's table had quieted. His group, who had laughed so freely at her expense earlier, now avoided eye contact, their conversation subdued. The boldness that once filled their corner of the restaurant had evaporated, leaving only an awkward silence in its place. The night continued, but Deborah felt lighter. Each step she took through the dining room felt more purposeful, her confidence blooming in a way she hadn't expected. As she refilled glasses and cleared plates, patrons stopped her to offer kind words. "You're incredible," one older woman said softly as Deborah set down a coffee cup. "I don't think I've ever heard anything so moving." "Keep going," another man added. "You've got something special. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Deborah thanked them with quiet humility, her heart swelling with gratitude. These weren't just compliments. They were confirmations of everything she'd worked for, everything she'd dreamed of becoming. Leonard, however, was not so gracious. As Deborah approached his table to deliver the check, he looked up at her with an expression that teetered between annoyance and reluctant admiration. "You've made your point," he said, his tone clipped. "No need to rub it in." Deborah paused, meeting his gaze directly. "It was never about proving anything to you," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I just wanted to play." Leonard had no response. He fidgeted with his drink, his once commanding presence reduced to an awkward shuffle. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and everyone at the table knew it. As Leonard scribbled his signature on the check, one of his companions, a younger man with a softer demeanor, looked at Deborah and said, "You were amazing, truly." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and for a moment she saw a flicker of humanity in a group she had written off as shallow. "Thank you," she replied, offering a small smile before walking away. The night ended with Leonard and his group leaving quietly, their usual grand exit replaced by a hasty retreat. Deborah watched them go, feeling neither triumph nor bitterness. She wasn't thinking about Leonard anymore. Her mind was already on the next step. The tips from that night were unusually generous, enough to cover her rent and leave a little extra for piano lessons she'd been postponing. As she locked up and walked home, the crisp air filling her lungs, Deborah felt something she hadn't felt in years: certainty. She wasn't just a waitress, and she wasn't just a dreamer. She was an artist, and nothing, not mocking words, not financial struggles, not fear, could take that away from her. But as she walked, her thoughts weren't on the night's conflict. They were on the future, where her dreams finally felt closer than ever. Deborah sat on the worn bench in her small apartment, her fingers gliding over the keys of her old upright piano. The sound wasn't as crisp or rich as the grand piano at La Fontaine, but it didn't matter. The music came from her heart, just as it always had. That night, something shifted within her. Not just a moment of triumph, but a realization that her talent wasn't something she needed to hide or justify. It was hers, and it was enough. In the days that followed, the events at the restaurant became something of a local story. Patrons who had witnessed her performance shared the tale, and word began to spread. A few days later, Deborah received a call from a man who had been dining that night, a music producer visiting from Nashville. He wasn't offering fame or fortune, but a chance to record a demo, a step towards something she had only dared to dream of. Deborah agreed, not because she believed it would change her life overnight, but because it felt like a door opening, one she wasn't afraid to walk through. For years she had let fear and doubt whisper lies into her mind, telling her she wasn't enough, that her dreams were too big. But now she saw the truth. Resilience and authenticity were her greatest strengths. The incident with Leonard Grayson wasn't just a humiliating spectacle turned victory, it was a reminder of the power of integrity. Leonard, for all his wealth and bravado, had nothing that could diminish her. He represented every voice of doubt she had ever faced, and she silenced him with nothing but the purity of her craft. To anyone watching her story, Deborah's message was clear. Never let someone else define your worth. The world is full of Leonard Graysons, people who project their insecurities onto others to feel powerful. But true power comes from staying rooted in who you are and letting your passions speak louder than their ridicule. As she closed the piano lid and rested her hands on the faded wood, Deborah smiled. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time it felt like it had truly begun. What about you? What dream have you been holding back on because of fear or doubt? Don't wait for someone like Leonard to test you. Take your step forward. Now, if Deborah's story inspired you, subscribe for more stories of resilience and triumph. Your story could be next.